So in this main function, we can use the gin package and then the dot notation to access features from this package. And this package offers a lot of features, but here we can simply start by calling the default function, which will set up a so-called engine for us. And that simply means that behind the scenes, it essentially configures an HTTP server for us, which in this case already comes with some middleware when using the default function here, the logger and recovery middleware, which simply means that it gives us an HTTP server that already has some basic functionality to log incoming requests and to automatically recover if some part of our program should crash, so that not the entire server crashes, which would be rather bad if this would be running in production. And that's one of the reasons why I'm using Gin. It is easy to set up such a pre-configured server with that package. So that's what we get when running default. As a result, we'll get back a handle to that engine, a pointer to that engine value that was created, and I'll store that in a variable named server. The name, of course, is up to you though. Well, and then we can use this server to call the run function to start it. So that when this main function executes, this server is started and starts listening for incoming requests. Now we can actually also pass an address string to run, and here I want to pass a string to run where I add a colon and then 8080 to make sure that we listen to incoming requests on some domain and then port 8080. And during development here, that will be localhost 8080. That will be the domain that's used here locally on the system, and this here will then be the port on which we listen for incoming requests. So with that, we got a running server, but at the moment, this server isn't doing much, except for some logging and error recovery, but we don't really have any logic that would be executed for incoming requests. And we're not prepared to handle different requests that might be sent to different endpoints. And we can change this by again using this server pointer here, this engine pointer, and then again the dot, and then we can register a handler for an incoming HTTP request, for example, by using this get function. And this simply means that we're now setting up a handler for an incoming get request. HTTP supports different kinds of requests. Get, post, put, patch, delete are pretty much the most important kinds of requests. And with get, we register a handler for an incoming get request. Now this get function then wants two main arguments, or actually one important argument and then an unlimited amount of arguments thereafter. And the first argument it wants is the path to which the request should be sent. So which GET request sent to which path should be handled. And that's then the second part. You can set up a bunch of handlers, which in the end simply are functions, that will be executed for such an incoming request then. So here we could, for example, say that we want to handle incoming requests to /events. Incoming GET requests to /events, to be precise. And we can then set up a function here as a second argument that will be executed if such a GET request is sent to /events. That can be an anonymous function, but it can also be some named function that you create somewhere else in your program. For example, here we could add a function below the main function, for example, that is called getEvents. The name, of course, is totally up to you. And this function should then send back a response, because that's the idea behind such a HTTP server. We get a request and we should send back a response. This response is sent back with help of a context parameter, which will be passed to this function automatically by Gin if we register this function as a handler for this get function here. So this context parameter will be set by Gin, and it will be a pointer to the Gin context. So that is the type of the parameter. Context here, as you see, is a struct, and we'll get a pointer to such a struct automatically as an input to this function if we set this function as a handler for this endpoint here, which we do by simply using it like this. So by not executing it here, but instead by using it as a value, which you can do as you learned, so that getEvents will be invoked by Gin whenever a GET request reaches /events. And inside of getEvents, we can now do whatever we want to do. We can reach out to a database to fetch events, which is something we'll do later. We can write to a file, whatever needs to be done. Here, I just want to send back a response, and that can be done with help of this context parameter, which we're getting here. This context parameter has a bunch of methods and fields which we can access. For example, we can access the incoming request to take a closer look at it and read its body, for example. But we can also simply send back a response for now by executing this JSON function that's part of this context struct here. So we don't send back a response by returning anything, but instead by calling JSON. At least if we want to send back a response in JSON format. If we would want to send back a response in HTML format, which we could also do, but which would be uncommon for a REST API, you could call the HTML function. Here, however, I want to send back data that's formatted as JSON, which is pretty much the default when building REST APIs, and we can do that with this JSON function then. Well, and then to this JSON function, we should pass two pieces of data, two arguments. A HTTP status code with which we can tell the client whether everything worked, and then some data that will be translated and transformed to JSON automatically by this Gin package. So we don't have to do that manually. Now here I want to send the 200 status code, which means everything worked, and we can either type it like this manually, or we can use the HTTP package, which is part of Go, so which is part of the standard library, and then there access status OK. And that in the end is just a constant that stores the number 200, as you can see here. So both works, but this here is a bit more readable, even by people who don't know all these available status codes by heart. By the way, attached you find a link to a resource that lists all the status codes you could send back. So here it is this status code, and then, as mentioned, we have to attach some data that we want to send back, and that data can really be anything. It can, for example, also be some raw text, a string, for example. It could be another number, any number of your choice. But very often it will, of course, be a struct or something like this. Gin, the package, also gives us a custom type built into the package, which in the end is just an alias for this map type here, which we could, of course, also write down ourselves, but an H is simply shorter than writing this, which allows us to quickly create a map, which we can also send back here. Because besides structs, maps are another common type of data that will be sent back. Maps and slices, I'd say. And here we can then simply create a basic map where we have a key named message with a value hello, something like this. Because the map that is in the end aliased by H is a map with a string key and then any kind of value. So here I have a string key, and then in this case a string as a value, but that could be anything. And that's how we'll send back a response whenever a request reaches /events, a GET request, I should say. So with that, we spent quite some time setting this up, but it is important to understand how these things work together. And therefore, if we now save this all, and we then open our terminal and run this, you will see that now we have an ongoing process here, And I also get a little pop-up by my browser that tells me that I got an application running that's listening on port 8080. So indeed, I could click on Open in Browser here. And you see that this process keeps on running. You could quit it by pressing Ctrl+C, but it will keep on running, of course, because we're waiting for incoming requests. Such a web server should keep on running. It shouldn't exit on its own because you wanna keep on waiting for requests. That's the main purpose of an application like this. You also see some log messages here, like for example that we're running in debug mode and that we have this endpoint here, which we're supporting at the moment. And therefore, with all that, we can open a new browser tab and then visit localhost 8080 and then /events. And if you do that, you should get back this data here, this JSON data. And if you open the browser developer tools and you reload the page, you can also see that request here in those developer tools. You see that it was sent to the events path. You see the status code we get back. This is this OK status code. If you click on it and you click on headers, you also see that we got JSON data back as a type of content for the response data. And if you take a look at the response, you can see that raw response here as well. So that is the first request we sent and the first request we handled with this Gin package. You also see the log messages here that in the end log all these incoming requests and the status code that was sent back and so on. Now with that, I'll quit that server by pressing Ctrl+C because now I want to continue adding more features to this REST API.